When it comes to knowing whether or not a character's death was good, there are 3 criteria we need to look at. 1. Does the way in which the character died make sense, or is it sort of just randomly put together and it isn't really coherent as to how the character died the way they did? 2. Is the plot ruined because this character has died? And 3. If the outcome of the fight was the opposite, would the story still be good? We are going to be taking these 3 questions and applying them to the death of Satoru Gojo. And I also just want to say that only about 5% of you guys who watch the channel are actually subscribed, so if you haven't subscribed, then please try it out. So for just a quick rundown, we are going to be seeing, for question 1, does the way in which Gojo died make sense? For question 2, is the plot ruined now that Gojo has died? And question 3, if the outcome was the opposite and Gojo actually won the fight with Sukuna, would the story still be good or as good as the outcome we actually got? So now that you know all 3 of the questions we are going to be getting into, let's get started by answering question number 1. Does the way in which Gojo died make sense? So we know that although Sukuna the entire fight was able to hit Gojo with slashes while Gojo was trapped inside his domain expansion, there was something Sukuna just couldn't do, and that was slash Gojo through his infinity. But as we know, Sukuna fought Gojo while he was inside Megumi's body, so he had access to the 10 Shadows Curse technique. And inside of the 10 Shadows Curse technique lies Maharaga. Now, we know that Sukuna says that he used Maharaga as a model. He used Maharaga as a model to see how to get through infinity, because we saw earlier in the fight that Maharaga was able to turn off infinity, but the way in which Maharaga adapted back then, it only allowed for Maharaga himself to hit Gojo. Sukuna was looking for a different type of adaptation, an adaptation that would allow Sukuna himself to get through infinity. So in chapter 236, we see Sukuna explain exactly how he used Maharaga to slice through infinity. Now here is the explanation. Sukuna says that Maharaga's adaptation starts after receiving a single attack, and then it slowly starts to analyze the attack in order to adapt to it. But if Maharaga is hit by that same attack again, then the adaptation speeds up. It's basically just saying that if you throw a blue at Maharaga, the adaptation will begin to start, but if you keep hitting it with blue and blue again, then the adaptation will speed up. Sukuna also says that once a technique is adapted to, the analysis does not stop there. Maharaga continues to adapt further. Now, what Sukuna means by this is he is saying that Maharaga will not just find one solution to your curse technique. Maharaga is capable of finding multiple solutions. And in the next page, Sukuna tells us exactly how Maharaga was able to do this to Gojo's infinity. Sukuna says that Maharaga adapted to infinity in 2 ways during the fight with Gojo. The first adaptation, Sukuna says, was Maharaga altering its own curse energy in order to neutralize and nullify the infinity. But Sukuna says that this is something he was unable to do, so Sukuna just waited until Maharaga found a different adaptation. Now this adaptation is the one Sukuna was able to do. Sukuna says the second adaptation was exactly what I had been anticipating, but it wasn't sending slashes flying as I do, it was expanding the technique's target. Its intended target wasn't just you, Gojo Satoru, but space, the entire world, existence itself. It targeted everything before it unleashed those slashes. Your infinity meant nothing. As long as it existed within that space, that world, it would all be torn apart. It was a near impossible technique to pull off, but that model proved to be quite effective. Now, what Sukuna is saying here is that Sukuna was no longer going to aim for Gojo. What Maharaga adapted to and the solution Maharaga found was to expand the curse technique's target to space itself. All this is saying is that even if Gojo has his infinity up, Gojo is standing on Earth. He is taking up some space on Earth. Now the place where Sukuna cut Gojo was his hip, but the way Sukuna says he used to attack Gojo was by sending a slash flying towards Gojo's hip. But the difference here is that Sukuna did not aim for Gojo's hip this time. Sukuna aimed for the space in which Gojo's hip existed. So, instead of trying to cut Gojo's hip, Sukuna tried to cut the space in which Gojo's hip existed, and by cutting the space where Gojo's hip existed, he cut Gojo's hip. I mean, geez, what do you do? Truly. Sukuna even says that he found a way to cut existence itself through the use of Maharaga's adaptation. Alright, so let's take a step back and analyze whether or not the way in which Gojo died here makes sense or not. We know that Maharaga's adaptation was always an element to the story, so it's no surprise there that Maharaga found a way to adapt to infinity. I think that everybody pretty much knew that that was the game plan for Sukuna going into the fight with Gojo. Use Maharaga to adapt to infinity, and then we go from there. But we're gonna return to this Maharaga adaptation in just a moment. First, does it even make sense that Sukuna was able to cut Gojo? I mean, say even if he did adapt to infinity and learned how to do this existence cutting slash, why did Gojo not move out of the way? He had just landed 4 black flashes and he was more amped than ever in this fight at this point. But out of nowhere, he had just gotten cut in half. Well, I think that the best answer to that question would be Gojo probably just didn't think the slash would do anything to him. Two things. Either Gojo didn't think the slash would do anything because, I mean, let's be honest, he had just hit Sukuna with a purple. It could have been out of desperation that Sukuna was letting off a final slash to try to hit Gojo, and Gojo probably thought, oh, this is some desperate slash. None of his slashes have worked so far, so I'm not that worried about it. And maybe Gojo got cut in half that way. Or 2, the slash was just too fast. So let's look at both of these answers for a moment. Does it make sense that Gojo wouldn't have moved out of the way of the slash? And I think that makes sense. Think about it, if you're in Gojo's shoes, you've just hit Sukuna with a purple. It's seemingly nothing that Sukuna can do to get through to you. His domain expansions aren't putting you down. You're sort of winning the exchanges because up until this point, it did seem like Gojo was winning most of the exchanges. So if you see Sukuna try to launch one more slash, you might just think it's out of desperation. You're not going to be that worried about it because you have the infinity, so the slash will just bounce right off of you. And maybe in thinking that, Gojo got cut. And the second question is, well, what if the slash was just too fast, even if Gojo saw it coming and knew it was dangerous? I can also see a way in which this makes sense because we don't actually get to see the speed of the slash other than we saw in Kashimo's fight with Sukuna. Sukuna warned Kashimo to dodge the slash before he threw it, so Kashimo had a warning to dodge the slash before. But it is still important to note that even in this form, this curse technique Kashimo form, which is the strongest form he has, he still got clipped by Sukuna's world-cutting slash, even though Sukuna had just warned him to dodge it beforehand. And after getting clipped by the slash, Kashimo recognizes this slash and says, "This is the cut that ended Gojo's life." And the last question that people may have about how Sukuna was able to cut Gojo is, well, how did Gojo not see Sukuna's chanting or hear him whatsoever? And the only answer I have to that is Sukuna either muttered the chants to where Gojo couldn't hear it, or Gojo just ignored them. Either one of those answers makes sense to me, although I do think that Sukuna probably just muttered the incantations for the world slash, so Gojo wasn't able to hear them. But either way, the way in which Sukuna was able to cut Gojo through the use of Maharaga's adaptation, and him being able to now cut space itself, because this was brought about through Maharaga's adaptation, and earlier in this series it was stated that Maharaga was able to adapt to and overcome anything, I think that it makes sense that Sukuna was able to cut Gojo and kill him here. My only critique for this cut would be how rushed it seems, because there was a very massive and very quick leap from the end of chapter 235 to the beginning of chapter 236. At the end of chapter 235, Gojo looked like in the best shape of the fight so far. Sukuna was weakened by the purple that he just got hit by, and Gojo landed 4 back flashes and was amped. But as we saw, somehow in a way that we didn't see, Sukuna was able to cut Gojo. Now, yes, we know how he was able to cut him, but it's just very quick. The way in which Gege switched from Sukuna looking like the loser in that fight to just winning not even half a chapter later. And it's not just me saying it's rushed. Gege himself said that because of the break that happened for the chapters, it seems like he forgot to write one of them, and he said this right after writing the end of Gojo's life. So even Gege himself is recognizing that because there was a break for the Jujutsu Kaisen manga, Gege seemed to have forgotten to write a chapter. But when it comes to the overall question of the way in which Gojo died making sense, I think that because of everything I've explained so far, it does make sense how Gojo died, because of Sukuna's use of Maharaga and the adaptation ability in order to cut through infinity. Now we can move on to question 2 of whether or not the plot is ruined or smeared because of Gojo's death. And I will honestly say that I don't think the plot is ruined, simply because we have sort of been witnessing a Yuji redemption arc, and although what I'm about to say is Gege's fault for this even being a fact in the first place, we do know that Yuji has sort of been basically suffering the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen. And although Yuji is strong in his own right, he is nowhere near as strong as he needs to be in order to save people like his sensei Gojo when it comes to fighting against very strong opponents like Sukuna, Kenjaku, or even Arame. Even at this point in time, Yuji's not able to fight against any of those three, not even Arame. Now we know that Hikari is fighting Arame and Yuta went and cut Kenjaku's head off, and now we see that Yuji is fighting against Sukuna, and I think that this is sort of mainly the play that Gege has been trying to set up here. Gege has been bullying Yuji the majority of the series, and now Yuji is finally able to step up and try his best to redeem the death of his sensei. But it's not even just Yuji. You know, this whole arc has been revolved around Gojo versus Sukuna, but now we are starting to see the emergence and way more activity of side characters who we all know and love, like Hikari, Yuta, and eventually Maki. We even got to see Kusakabe, Higuruma, Yuji, and Ino all fight side by side against Sukuna. Yes, even somebody like Kusakabe and Ino were fighting against Sukuna. And this is all possible because of Gojo's death. And we still have that plot line of Yuta cutting Kenjaku's head off, and we still are not sure of where that is going to go yet. But the simple fact that we don't know where it's leading to yet is proof enough of the fact that even with Gojo gone, the plot is still very interesting and keeps us on the edge of our seats. And we also don't see what I would say any bad writing happening so far. We've seen Higuruma start to emerge and grow in his fight with Sukuna, and even though it seems as if Higuruma has died, he did help so much in this fight against Sukuna, even by passing off the sword to Yuji before he passed. And right now the fight between Hikari and Arame is still going on, and that fight is extremely interesting within itself. So I would say that even though Gojo is passed, the plot is not ruined whatsoever. Everything you would look forward to when it comes to a shonen manga, interesting fights, interesting characters, and an interesting storyline where you're not sure where it'll go, but you're just enjoying the ride, all of those elements are still in Jujutsu Kaisen currently with Gojo passing. So I would say that when it comes to answering question number 2, I don't think that the plot is ruined whatsoever because Gojo has died. If anything, the plot arguably has become more interesting. And I'll get more into that as I answer question number 3 on if Gojo won the fight instead of Sukuna, would the outcome have led to a good storyline? And I do want to say that I do think there is a good storyline possible without killing Gojo, and I do want to credit this storyline to my good friend Six, who believed that Gojo did not need to die in the fight against Sukuna for the plot to continue. Sukuna instead could have gone after what Gojo values the most, and that is Gojo's students, because we know that Gojo has said multiple times that his main goal is to start a new age of sorcery, and he wants to cultivate and grow these young students into being strong sorcerers and good people. And I do want to say that I think this storyline is probably the only one I would like if Gojo were to live, because I wouldn't have liked it if Gojo just beat Sukuna and Gojo himself and all of the students were left alive. I feel like something needed to be lost from the main cast in this fight against Sukuna, because it's not like it's a fight against just any small antagonist. We're talking about the big villain of Jujutsu Kaisen, Ryomen Sukuna. So I feel like something needed to be lost. we lost to Gojo in the actual storyline, but if Gojo actually killed Sukuna in their fight, but Sukuna had killed some of the main characters instead, I actually still would have liked that outcome, because instead of killing Gojo, Sukuna would have been killing what Gojo loved the most, which was his students. Now, although I do think that this storyline of Gojo living in the fight against Sukuna, obviously he would be able to go on and stop Kenjaku in his tracks from bringing about the merger for Japan, and basically the good guys would win. I do prefer the ending that we got in the fight with Gojo and Sukuna, because I believe that Gojo losing the fight and basically it being left up to the main characters to defeat Sukuna creates more of a sense of urgency and more of a sense of hope and basically faith for the main cast that they can overcome such a powerful foe. And because this threat with Sukuna and his interesting ideologies and philosophies that we see Sukuna have, it makes it interesting enough to where I'm not mad that Sukuna actually won the fight with Gojo. I do see a storyline in which Gojo does beat Sukuna and the story still makes sense and actually would be relatively enjoyable. But I prefer the storyline we did get where Sukuna beat Gojo in the end. So for the answer to question number 3, I would say that it actually is possible for if the fight were to have the opposite outcome where Gojo won instead of Sukuna, it still would have been a good storyline because Gege would have been able to make that storyline interesting as well, but I don't think that that storyline is as good as the storyline we got. So now that I have taken a deep dive into all 3 of these questions, it's time for me to give my answer on whether or not I think that Gojo's ending was bad. And my honest answer is no. My only contention with Gojo's death at all was how quick it happened, the sudden shift from Gojo seeming like he basically won the fight to Gojo just dying the page right after. I actually would have preferred it if Gege showed more when it came to that area, and Gege, like I said earlier, himself admit that it seemed like he skipped a chapter in writing the death of Gojo. So I do like the execution of Gojo's death, the way he died by Maharaga's adaptation, but I would have preferred if we got more of it instead of just this quick and sudden shift from Gojo winning to just being dead the next page. But other than that, I do think that Gege did an amazing job in showcasing Gojo versus Sukuna, and actually, even though it was sad, did a good job in writing the death of Gojo Satoru. With that being said, I want to thank you so much for reaching the end of the video, and if you enjoyed, then I would really appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe to the channel, as I do post on different topics that you guys give me and a few that I come up with on my own. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.